So thank you for joining me tonight. We have a good crowd. You are attending the National Park Service's Protected Species in the North Country Trail information session. We're going to chat about protected species that make the North Country Trail areas their home. I think I've met a lot of you, but if I haven't yet, I'm Steph Ligori, the NEPA specialist for the North Country Trail National Park Service. And for your awareness, tonight's session is being recorded, and there will be a Q&A towards the end. So the general purpose of this evening's session is to educate and inform you about the protected species and their habitats that have a potential to be on or near the NCT. You're not expected to be an expert on protected species by the end of the session, nor are you ever expected to be an expert on the subject. I just hope that it gives you a little bit of background knowledge so you feel more informed about how protected species intersect with the North Country Trail. And mostly, I hope you find this presentation interesting and enjoyable while also maybe learning something new about flora and fauna. I also hope that it empowers you to conserve and protect imperiled species that could have a potential to be impacted from trail work. We will talk a little bit about how trail work could potentially impact these species, as well as some of the conservation measures that you can implement during trail work to aid in their continued existence. And finally, as I mentioned, we'll close out this session with an open Q&A for you to ask any questions or make any comments. But the Q&A session is not the only time for you to ask questions or inquire more about protected species. And I hope to encourage an open and continuing dialogue between the volunteers, the NCTA and the MPS regarding the conservation of these species. So I do want to start off with some definitions of some of the terms that I'll be using tonight. First is endangered. An endangered species is any species that is in danger of extinction in the foreseeable future. That could be because of massive habitat loss, population declines, or other reasons. A threatened species is any species that is likely to become in danger of extinction, or they are likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. So they are not endangered yet, but there is a foreseeable possibility that they could get there. I will also be using the more encapsulating term of protected. Not all protected species are threatened or endangered, and it could include those that might be protected for other reasons. So if a species is not threatened or endangered, it might be protected because it has the potential to become threatened. It has some sort of relative rareness. It might be concerning in some other way, or it could be to prevent that species from backsliding into previously low population numbers. And finally, I'm going to be using the term critical habitat. Critical habitats are specific designated habitat areas that are essential and critical for the conservation and management of a threatened and endangered species. And they are federally designated areas. I'd also like to give a little bit of background on the legislative and regulatory side of protecting species, since that does lay the groundwork and guidelines for why and how threatened and endangered species are protected today. So in the beginning of endangered species regulation, throughout the 20th century, there were several laws, treaties, and programs that were implemented to respond to flora and fauna that were undergoing serious population declines, or they were going extinct due to human-related activities and impacts. But unfortunately, all those laws and programs were not enough, and the species were continuing to decline. So in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was enacted to really define and strengthen the protection and conservation of imperiled species. The Endangered Species Act is considered to be the landmark law in protecting threatened and endangered species, and it provides a generally broad framework for facilitating their conservation. Under the Endangered Species Act, there are two agencies, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries, that share responsibility for implementing the act. NOAA generally maintains responsibility for marine species. So for our purposes, the Fish and Wildlife Service is the program planning and permitting authority regarding federally threatened, endangered, and other protected species. However, states do have the authority to, and they often do, implement further conservation measures or state laws beyond what the Fish and Wildlife Service might recommend. States can also include additional non-federal species onto state-specific protection listings. And state threatened and endangered species and their listings and their protection is usually regulated through state DNR offices or DECs, and sometimes the game offices. So since the state and the Fish and Wildlife Service, the appropriate state office, are the primary information holders and regulators regarding protected species, the National Park Service may communicate and consult with them during the compliance and review process for a North Country Trail project when it is appropriate. In that consultation, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state could recommend conservation measures for a specific project that aid in the protection of a threatened or endangered species or their habitat. And I'll just note, because of the multitude of ecological conditions across the North Country Trail and the need for a broad approach when we're talking about the entire trail, I am focusing tonight's conversation a little bit more on federal listed species, although that doesn't negate any species that might be listed only by the state. All right, so when we're thinking about protected species specific to the North Country Trail, those that could be on or around, the list is extensive, right? We have 4,800 miles of trail in 8 states. At my last count, there were just over 30 of just federally listed species, threatened or endangered, with a potential to be on or around the North Country Trail. So this slide is not a complete list, but it does include some species and the critical habitats that are near the North Country Trail. So on here, I do have the piping plover. It is a threatened shorebird that has habitat on Great Lake coastlines and other large water bodies or wetland complexes. It has critical habitat in Petoskey State Park, Wilderness State Park, some areas along Lake Superior in Michigan, and also at Lake Sakawea in North Dakota. In the center here is the rabbit's foot mussel. It is threatened, and it does have critical habitat in the Allegheny River in Pennsylvania. Hines emerald dragonfly is an endangered insect with an area of critical habitat in Hiawatha National Forest in Michigan. In the corner bottom here is the Eastern Prairie Fringe orchid. It is a threatened wetland plant in Ohio and southern Michigan. It does not have any critical habitat, but I just wanted to show that plants are included on threatened and endangered species lists. In the center is the Canada link, probably one that you might be familiar with. It is an elusive threatened wild cat in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, and it does have critical habitat in the Superior National Forest. I also have 2 butterflies here, the Dakota skipper and the power chic skipperling. They are threatened and endangered respectively, and they do have some critical habitats in Cheyenne National Grasslands in North Dakota, and or in some wildlife management areas between Detroit Lakes and Fargo in Minnesota. And then at the top here, I do have the bald eagle on this slide. The bald eagle is not listed as threatened or endangered, but it is federally protected under something called the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And I like to include the bald eagle because it is very recognizable and it does have a presence in all North Country Trail states. So when we're thinking about these species and the others that are around the North Country Trail, what are the North Country Trail activities that could potentially impact these species, and how do they impact them? Generally, we would think of trail structure and amenity maintenance and new construction as having the potential to impact a protected species or their habitat if those species and their habitats have the potential to or are in a project area. Some of the impacts to a protected species might include direct or indirect habitat damage. So for example, the direct impact could be from directly cutting down a habitat tree. Indirect impact could be from runoff that goes into a habitat waterway. It could include disturbance during sensitive times, such as making a lot of noise when they're trying to raise their young. Let's see, then it could also include access and travel barriers. An example of this would be moving rocks in a stream in a way that the aquatic species can no longer travel and access their habitat like they used to. Trash or other unnatural materials is another impact to consider, such as that might be at a campsite. And then finally, I have listed here the likelihood for an actual encounter with a protected species. This list isn't exhaustive of every potential impact, and the actual impacts and level of impact are highly variable depending on the project and the location and the time of year and a lot of other factors. And I'll note that an impact determination on a protected species from the kinds of activities that are happening on the North Country Trail does not permanently stop or prevent a project. At least I've never seen that happen. This is where conservation measures come in that either avoid or lessen the impacts. And we're going to talk a little bit more about conservation measures in the presentation later. There we go. There are 3 federally protected species in particular that I have denoted as notable. These species are not any more notable than other species in a regulatory or protection sense. And it doesn't mean that another protected species will not have a potential for impact during any specific project implementation. But these 3 are notable to the North Country Trail because they have generally extensive habitat ranges across NCT states, and they're often under consideration for impacts when we're thinking about how their needs and habitats intersect with the trail. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in depth about the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, the Northern Long-Ear Bat, and the Indiana bat, so you can learn more about these 3 species that are distinguishable for the North Country Trail. So first up, we have the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, a little bit about their habitat. They have an extensive habitat range in lower Michigan, and they also have some small pockets of populations in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. They live in wetlands, and they are valuable to the wetland ecosystem and biodiversity. Frogs are a common food source of theirs, thus their attraction to wetlands. From about April 15th to October 15th is considered their active season, although there is a little bit of variation in their active season by about a few weeks, depending on the location. And during their active season, they might be moving around, they might be resting under a log, in tree roots, in an animal burrow, or they might be exposed, sunning themselves or basking themselves. In the winter, they do remain in the wetland and they will hibernate underground in a crayfish burrow or another animal burrow. And while wetlands are their preferred habitat, they do sometimes migrate to the drier upland areas that are adjacent to wetlands in the summer, possibly in search of voles or mice or other small mammals to eat. So how would you know if you see a Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake? What do they look like? They are small in a snake sense, about 2 feet long. They are a rattlesnake, and they do have the characteristic rattle that is distinguishing of their kind, grayish brown in color, with what is usually described as a video game controller or a bow tie shaped patches, like the video game controller you would hold like this with 2 hands. They are venomous, but they are regarded as pretty docile and skittish of humans. It is more likely that they would try and make an escape away from you if you come across them. And this snake is the only rattlesnake and the only venomous snake in Michigan. So if you see a snake with the characteristic rattle in Michigan, it is likely an Eastern Massasauga. New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio do have 2 other more common rattlesnake species in their states, so it's not necessarily true for those states. And at this link here, I do have a short video from the Michigan DNR that just gives a good 1-minute description of the snake and how to identify it. So I need to reshare my screen real quick. That'll be someone let me know if you can see the video right now.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right, I'm going to play it.
On this episode of 60-Second Snakes, we will be talking about Michigan's only venomous species of snake, the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, which is often found in or near wetland habitats, and whose population is declining due to habitat loss. Here's what to look for. First, look for a rattle. Massasaugas have a distinct segmented rattle, and even juvenile snakes will have the beginnings of a rattle on their tail at birth. Next, examine the size. Adult Massasaugas range from 1.5 feet to 3 feet in length. Finally, check the markings. The dark blotches on a Massasauga are edged in white and often resemble a video game controller or a bow tie. Massasaugas play an important role in the environment and provide people with free pest control services. If you see one of these rare snakes, count yourself lucky and enjoy it from a distance. Just remember, if you leave the snake alone, it will leave you alone. This has been 60-Second Snakes. Visit michigan.gov/wildlife to learn more. On this episode.
Cool. Thanks for watching that. Back to the PowerPoint. I get sent that video a lot, so I'm really glad that you were able to watch it with me today. I think it's a really good 1-minute description of the snake and what it looks like. All right, so our next slide is talking about why the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake is protected. What happened to get it to that point? So this snake has experienced several threats to its populations, namely loss of its wetland habitat, and as well as fragmentation from human development. Fragmentation is when the species habitat is broken up into smaller pieces, which confuses the species or limits its growth. For example, if a road is built right through the snake's habitat, the snake is now confused because it cannot travel through its habitat like it used to. Perhaps it can't find a mate anymore because its territory is much smaller. And this kind of human development can also lead to unnatural snake mortality, such as from vehicles. So today, less than half of historical eastern Massasauga rattlesnake populations exist, which did lead to the snake being listed as federally threatened in 2016. So that leads us to our next question is how can we protect and conserve this threatened snake during North Country Trail activities? Because of its listing under the Endangered Species Act, the Fish and Wildlife Service was able to formulate guidelines and measures that could avoid or lessen impacts to the species from human development. Some of them could be relevant to North Country Trail projects, depending on the factors of where the project is and what it is. And they're ones that could come up when talking to Fish and Wildlife Service or the state about a specific project's impact. I'm going to share what some of these measures are, but you do not need to remember any of these. I will inform your chapter that the National Park Service has completed compliance work on a project. I would include a list of the conservation measures that are recommended, if there are any. And the measures for any specific project could be highly variable in any number of these. One of the most common ones I see is simply awareness and education, which is what I hope we're partially doing today. So it's just simply your awareness that this snake exists. It could be in a wetland, and this is generally what it might look like. So awareness and education. Some other ones that could be recommended include cleaning equipment to avoid the spread of invasive plants in wetland habitat, which is likely something you're doing already in your project work. Wildlife safe materials sometimes comes up. This essentially means not using plastics or other unnatural netting materials for erosion control. For example, using straw or mulch instead of plastic fencing or plastic erosion matting, something that the snake could get caught in and wouldn't be able to escape. Let's see. So for new construction in a wetland, there's sometimes a consideration to use elevated boardwalks and puncheons that allow the snake to travel underneath, which I've noticed that elevation is often part of the puncheon design regardless. Sometimes avoidance of all construction during the snake's active season could be recommended, but that is very location specific and typically only recommended if the project is in a location where it is known that the snake exists. If your project includes placing signposts in a wetland, there could be a recommendation to avoid placing them in crayfish burrows or other animal burrows that the snake might use to hide in or to hibernate in. If your project is near a road, there could be a measure to minimize vehicle activity to the extent possible if snake habitat is nearby. And finally, another very common one is implementing the stop, lock, hold procedures during construction and maintenance work if you happen to discover or see one. If you attended my accidental discoveries presentation during the celebration, we went over these stop lock procedures in detail. When I send your chapter an email or a notification of MPS compliance completion, you might see this text here on the screen. Project work should stop and the MPS notified on the rare chance that a threatened or endangered species is inadvertently discovered during construction. So essentially what that means, on the rare chance you accidentally discover or see an eastern Massasauga rattlesnake during trail work, you would immediately and safely stop work on the project. You would lock the discovery in place by not disturbing it and leaving it where it is. And then you would get a hold of the National Park Service as soon as it was safely possible. If you're able to safely take a picture or denote where you saw it with flagging or something like that, you're welcome to do that, but you do not have to. You can contact me by phone, text, or email, whatever's easier for you. Accidental discoveries are rare, but they do happen, and they are made even more rare by the compliance process and review that the Park Service and the land managers are doing. And typically in the follow-up actions after an accidental discovery would be reported, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state would be contacted so that they can document the occurrence. And then there may be some additional conservation measures to consider when you go back to finish work on the project. Your landowner or land manager might also want to know about the discovery as well, particularly if you're working on federal or state land. All right, so our next species is the northern long-ear bat. This bat has very extensive habitat range and has the potential to be present in every North Country Trail state. Many people think of bats as living in caves. However, this bat spends most of the year living in trees. They will roost alone or in small colonies in live and dead trees, but they do have certain trees that they prefer. So based on all the studies that the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service has done, they have found that they prefer trees that are 3 inches or larger in diameter at breast height, or DBH. They tend to like trees that are older or those that have exfoliating and loose barks, cavities, crevices, things that they can roost and hide inside, like in this picture. Females will raise their young in what's called maternity roosts in the trees, typically between June 1st to July 31st. And this is called their pup season. They spend most of the daytime in the tree, emerging at dusk to feed on insects. Instead of trees, they can sometimes use bridges or other elevated structures to roost. And in the winter, they do migrate to caves, sometimes abandoned mines, to hibernate. And that's called their hibernaculum. So identifying, what does this guy look like? I will just say there are many bat species in NCT states, and many of them are common. In my opinion, they all look pretty similar, but I am not a bat biologist. I, of course, do not expect you to identify the difference between bats, and I myself would not feel comfortable simply looking at a bat and knowing what it was. Some bats live in trees, but not all do. If I ever saw a bat in a tree while I was working on that tree, even if I didn't know exactly what kind of bat it was, that would be reason enough for me to pause and reevaluate. But regardless, in the eyes of a bat biologist, the northern long-eared bats are distinguishable from other bats because they have large and long ears comparatively, thus their namesake. They are small, about 3 to 3.5 inches in length, with a 9 to 10 inch wingspan. And they are mammals, and they do have fur that is usually brown, tan, or tawny colored. So what happened and why are these bats have to be protected? The main reason is something called white nose syndrome, which is something you might have heard of before. It is a fungus that is believed to be invasive. It was first found in the US in 2006, and it spread quickly through bat populations since then. The fungus grows on bats' muzzles and their wings, and it does eventually cause their death. There's currently no cure for it. I have an article that I can link to you. It was in the handout that I sent out that provides a little bit more information about white nose syndrome. So let me know if you have an interest in that, and I can, maybe I'll put it in the chat at the end. In addition to white nose syndrome, these bats also experience some threats to their populations from loss of forest habitats, as well as pesticides and insecticides that impact their food source, insects. So because of these threats, the northern long-eared bats numbers have declined as much as 99% from their pre-white nose syndrome levels at some of their known hibernation sites. This all led to their federal listing in 2015. And at this link here, I have another video. It is a news story with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Service, and they are talking about the bats listing and their decline. So let me share that with you all.
Also raising awareness, the federal government declared one of North America's most widely distributed bats a threatened species because of the spread of a deadly fungal disease. It's called white nose syndrome, and it's killed millions of the flying mammals in the U.S. Well, now the northern long-eared bat is considered a threatened species. WPTZ's Jack Thurston has our story, new tonight.
If you hate mosquitoes, biologist Alyssa Bennett says you should love bats. They eat lots of bugs.
And they're also eating insects that are detrimental to agriculture and detrimental to the forest product industry.
This week, the federal government labeled the northern long-eared bat a threatened species.
This was one of the bats that didn't make it.
It and other kinds of bats have suffered for years from the mysterious white nose syndrome, leading to massive die-offs, millions of animals.
For this bat, 95 to 98% declines.
The fungus started showing up in New York around 2006, spreading to Vermont,
big cluster,
then the rest of New England and beyond, killing the insect eaters by causing them to wake early from their winter hibernation and then starve to death.
and we can't cure white nose syndrome.
No one has found a cure.
It's empty.
We took you to where bats hibernate, inside Mount Aeolus in southern Vermont in 2009.
In my opinion, this is a major national crisis.
Since then, Vermont listed the northern long-eared bat as endangered on the state level, essentially calling it on the brink of extinction. A federal status of threatened is like saying it'll be approaching that brink in the foreseeable future, meanwhile still allowing certain potentially disruptive activities like logging.
Most of us don't really encounter bats unless we're out at night for a barbecue or something and we see them flying around. What can we do to help them?
They love dead and dying trees. Landowners can keep those trees standing. A dead tree might be unsightly to us, but if it's not in a dangerous location, it could be a perfect place for a bat to roost.
She hopes the new federal designation convinces more people who may think these creatures are creepy that they're in fact vital to our ecosystems. In Rutland, Jack Thurston, WPTZ, News Channel 5.
We gotta tell people that Liberty Mutual.
All right, thank you. Bring back the PowerPoint here. And that was the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Service talking there. So we've talked about their threats, because they're listed as threatened, and as with the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, they do have some measures that could be taken to aid in their protection and conservation, depending on the variability of your project details and locations. Again, awareness and education. You're going to see this one all the time. It's a big one. I see this measure a lot. For our North Country Trail purposes, consideration for tree removal and cutting is another conservation measure that I often see come up. So if your project includes cutting or trimming trees, there could be a recommended measure to avoid cutting, removing, felling, or trimming those trees that are 3 inches diameter at breast height and that have the cracks and crevices that the bats might like to live in. To avoid doing that during the bat's most sensitive time, which is their pup season between June and July. In some cases, there could be a recommendation to avoid any construction during the pup season, although this is again location specific and likely only one we would see if there was a roost tree really close by. If you're performing maintenance on an existing bridge as part of your project, it would be recommended to safely look under the bridge for bats or signs of them before doing that maintenance, assuming you could do that safely. You'd probably need a flashlight, as they're really great at hiding in between bridge planks. You can kind of see them. I don't know if you can see them in this picture, but they're hidden right here, hidden right up underneath the bridge. And then finally, our stop, lock, hold procedures would apply again if you happen to spot a bat in a tree while you were working. All right, we have one final species to chat about in detail tonight, and that is the Indiana bat. It is another tree bat. It does have a smaller habitat range when compared to the northern long-ear bat. It is in the North Country Trail states from Vermont to Lower Michigan. As with their cousins, they roost alone or in colonies in live or dead trees. They have similar tree preferences to the northern long-eared bat, although they do prefer trees that are larger, so 5 inches DBH or greater. And their tree roosting season is typically between April 1st to September 30th. They also spend most of the daytime in the tree, emerging at dusk to feed on insects. And as with the northern long-eared bat, it's possible for them to sometimes roost under bridges or other elevated structures. In the winter, they also migrate to caves and abandoned mines to hibernate. These bats are pretty social, and they will often hibernate in very large, what's called cluster colonies. The Indiana bat is smaller than the northern long-eared bat, about 1.5 to 2 inches in length with a 9 to 11 inch wingspan. They have dull gray, dark brown, or almost black fur with mouse-like ears. It's how they get their scientific name. I think it's Latin for mouse ears or something like that, Latin or Greek. Their ears and general appearance are similar to other more common bats. So again, I don't expect you to know the difference between different species of bats by looking at them. So how did our Indiana bat become endangered? The Indiana bat has been experiencing significant threats and population declines for decades longer than the northern long-eared bat. Indiana bats are particularly sensitive to human disturbance, primarily when they're hibernating in their large cluster colonies. The rise of cave tourism and cave commercialism was a major impact to these bats while they were trying to hibernate. And then when white nose syndrome arrived to the US in 2006, the Indiana bats were also not immune to those effects. And as with the northern long-eared bats, it also experiences threats from forest habitat loss and the pesticides and insecticides that might impact their food source. So Indiana bats were listed as endangered in 1967. They once numbered in the millions, but due to the rise in human disturbance, their numbers were estimated below 250,000 by 1985. In the past, their numbers did experience some improvements with the federal protections, but then when white nose syndrome arrived, their population unfortunately experienced another hit with an estimated decrease of another 27%. So they are endangered. So our conservation measures, again, how can we potentially help these endangered species during North Country Trail activities? Awareness and education. See that one again, another very common one. As with the northern long-eared bat, there could be considerations for tree removal, cutting or trimming. The difference is that these considerations are for trees that are 5 dBH inches and greater during their entire roosting season. The Indiana bat is endangered, so their tree conservation measures do include the entire time that they might be in a tree, as opposed to just when they're raising their young during pup season. And as with the other bat, it's recommended to look under the bridge for bats or signs of bats before doing maintenance if you're able to safely do so. And then finally, we have our stop, lock, hold procedures again. I have another video. At this link is a video about the Indiana bat in Pennsylvania. The video is long, so I'm going to start it about halfway through, where they get to talking about the conservation measures. So a little bit of background about this video. It's about a private landowner who has agreed to work with federal and state agencies to protect known Indiana bat habitat on his property. In the video, you're going to hear from the landowner. He's in the camo shirt. And you'll also hear from representatives from the Fish and Wildlife Service, the NRCS, and the Pennsylvania Game Commission. And if you ever want to watch the whole video, let me know and I can link it. So let me share this video here. I think it's about, okay.
The property is really important to the federally endangered Indiana bat.
So in cooperation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Game Commission, and DCNR, we met with Mr. Belinda and walked his property. And due to the proximity to Canoe Creek State Park and hibernacula and known maternity colonies, decided this would be a good spot for permanent easement to specifically manage for bats.
We were able to work with NRCS through the Healthy Forest Reserve program to permanently protect over 800 acres of Mr. Belinda's property for the benefit of Indiana bats.
I do know some other large landowner friends of mine, and they said I was an idiot for getting the federal government involved in my properties. I look at it, why not use them as an asset instead of an enemy?
Yes, the Japanese barberry problem on the property. It inhibits regeneration of the highly desirable species that we're looking for. So he was provided with financial assistance to come out and spray Japanese barberry and other invasive species on the property.
They like this area, the bats, because almost every tree you see that's larger than your thigh is a tree species that is of high concern, that's good habitat. For instance, you look over there and see an elm tree.
As the tree matures, they tend to get those types of bark characteristics that the bats like, and they can just creep right under those crevices and find some place warm.
Yeah, so typically the older the tree, the more nooks and crannies and habitat it's going to offer.
But as part of forest health management, you need those younger age classes coming up to support the next generation of forest and future generations of bats as well.
Hopefully, we had bats emerge about 15 minutes ago. At this point, I'm hoping that we caught a couple bats that we can process. Oh, we got a lot of bats. A lot of the white nose scarring should be pretty well healed up. It shouldn't be as visible as when they first emerged from hibernation, so this bat looks fine. This is such a time that these organisms need our help. If you can imagine, when they used to trap Canoe Creek, this entire basket would be full of bats. They'd just be literally scooping bats out. Okay, female little brown adult. It's a great time to bring both the private and public together and really have everyone pull together to try and help save bats right now. Yep, there he goes.
It's just been awesome to be able to drive up the lane every day and realize that you can be a steward of something great.
There are bats that have found some way to adapt, so it's really a treat to recapture some of these bats.
Thanks for watching that video. We'll bring up the PowerPoint again. And yeah, let me know if you ever want to watch that whole video. I think the whole video is 6 minutes long or so, and I can share that with you. Okay, so back to our PowerPoint. Before I move on to the next slide, I'll just mention that I used this particular picture because I thought it was really funny, but neither of these bats actually drink blood. They just eat insects. All right, so those were our three species that are distinguishable for our North Country Trail that we talked about in a little bit of detail. So we learned a lot about them and their potential conservation measures. So you could be wondering, okay, but what are the conservation measures for my chapter's specific project? And if you ask me that question, I will not initially have an answer for you, or at least I won't be able to give you a straightforward answer. The recommended conservation measures, as I think I mentioned earlier, are highly variable, really depending on the type of project, the location, the potential level of impact. So I really can't give you an answer until there's some further research done or consultation with other agencies. So just to show how variable and different this could be across the entire North Country Trail, let's look at one single project example. Let's build 1/2 mile of new trail, but in 2 different locations with different features. And before we jump into these examples, these are just examples, and they're also examples that I've greatly simplified. And my intent here is just to communicate the significant amount of variability of protected species and their habitats and the potential impacts and conservations we would see across the entire trail. Again, you don't have to remember any of this, and the appropriate conservation measures would be communicated to you and recommended when you have a specific project. So for our first example, let's build that 1/2 mile of trail in an upland agricultural field in Wisconsin. For her project, all we're going to propose to do is mow the trail through that field. The Fish and Wildlife Service, in consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, they have identified the bald eagle, the Canada lynx, the northern long-eared bat, and the piping plover with a potential of occurring in the area, and they have no critical habitats identified in the area. And in this example, the trail build is covered under a broad state permit for state threatened and endangered species. So the NPS would simply document that with the state. So we're going to think about what our project area looks like, what are the features in our project area, what's the habitat like in our project area. It is open, it has no trees, it's in a previously heavily disturbed agricultural field, it's upland, there's no wetlands or water bodies in the area. And then we're also going to think about what are the habitat needs that our protected species need or what they prefer. We know from our research that bald eagles need a large open body of water. The Canada lynx likes a forested habitat and limited disturbance, and they have a very large territory area. The bat, of course, needs the roosting trees, and the piping plover prefers a water body or a coastline to breed at. So with this information, the likelihood of these species or their habitat of being present in the project area is very low or non-existent. So at this point in our simplified example, there are not any specific conservation measures to recommend other than the general awareness that of their listing and then the implementation of stop block hold procedures on the off chance you happen to spot one while you were mowing. And then we're going to do a second example. And this is the same 1/2 mile of trail, but this time it's going to be in a forest that contains some wet ground in Michigan. The project includes some cutting and trimming of trees, shrubs, and undergrowth in order to create the trail prism. Because of the wet ground, there's going to be about 100 feet of puncheon, in the design. So when consulting with the Fish and Wildlife Service, they identify the bald eagle, the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, the northern long-eared bat, and the eastern prairie fringe orchid with a potential of occurring in the area, and there's no critical habitats. And then the state also identifies those federally listed species in addition to a state threatened frog called the Blanchard's cricket frog with a potential to occur in the area. So we're thinking about what our project area looks like, what features it has, what habitat it has. It is forested, it is lowland, and it has wet ground. And we're also thinking about what kind of impacts our project is putting onto that habitat. So there are direct impacts to trees and the wetland. And then based on the research from the Fish and Wildlife State, again, we know our bald eagles need that large open body of water. Our bats need the trees. The eastern Massasauga rattlesnake prefers to live in wetlands. The eastern prairie fringe orchid also likes wetlands, but it likes open and sunny wetlands. And our Blanchard's cricket frog likes a water body, like a pond. So in this simplified example, there would likely be recommended measures for the rattlesnake and the bat. So again, we have our awareness and our stop, block, hold procedures. Those are pretty consistent ones. They're very standard. But then we might also get recommendations about avoiding cutting trees that are 3 inches DBH and greater with those characteristics that bats like to live in, like the nooks and crannies and crevices between June and July, which is their sensitive time, their pup season. There could be a recommendation to clean your equipment to prevent invasive spread in the wetland, which is likely something you're already doing. If you were putting signposts on the trail, just avoiding putting them in existing animal burrows so that in case the snakes were hiding or hibernating in there. Having the puncheon to be elevated so that the snake can travel underneath of it. And then if the project happened to include erosion control, using those wildlife safe materials, so non-plastic and non-natural netting materials. All right, so that is all I have to share for tonight, although there could be a lot more. So with that, let's enter into our Q&A, or if you don't have questions, feel free to just make comments. And you can unmute yourself or write a question in the chat. Haven't looked at the chat yet.
No questions in the chat yet, Steph.
Okay. Any questions, comments, thoughts?
This is Deb Mattis. I don't have any questions, but I think it's a wonderful presentation.
Oh, good.
Because I've just done a few, helped out on trail maintenance and trail building projects. And so this is great information for awareness for me. And I was actually hiking today with my friend, and we were commenting on the trees down in Oak Openings, the great big ones that are still standing that are dead, partially standing. And now that gives me a whole new perspective on that. When I go back to hike with my friend, we're going to be looking in the crevices.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and even, I mean, I know we talk about these protected species during trail work, because that's when I would think of them as being impacted in some, adverse or potentially negative way. But if you ever happen to spot one of these species out on the trail, I would love to know just when you're hiking, and the Fish and Wildlife Service would love to know. They like to document the occurrences so that they know where they're traveling around and where they're located. So, I mean, even on your hikes, you see one. Yeah.
That's cool. Well, we also do geocaching, so we're real familiar with getting waypoints and GPS coordinates. So, and I know at Oak Openings, they have ground nesting species of sparrow So they close off part of one of the trails down there during their breeding and baby raising season. They've got the Carner blue butterfly, which I have yet to see. I'll probably have a heart attack if I ever see one in person. So they've got quite a few rarer species down there. So I'm always keeping an eye out. But thank you. Wonderful presentation.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you enjoyed it. The Carner blue butterfly is also federally protected, although at the moment I can't remember if it's threatened or endangered. So yeah, I mean, as you said, your land managers and landowners you're working with they also probably have their own protection measures in place that are outside of what the Park Service is doing during our compliance and review process. So cool. It's good to hear. Any other questions? I do have my contact info here. If you ever wanted to come up, if a question comes up later, like I said, I hope this encourages an open and continuing dialogue, even if you just want to talk about protected species, let me know. Or if you want to talk through how your specific project could impact a species, or you want to talk about accidental discoveries or seeing one out on the trail, let me know. And tonight's session was recorded, so it will be available for viewing later if you want to revisit it. All right. Thanks all. There's no questions. Oh wait, I see something popping up in the chat maybe. You send out copies of the PowerPoint. I definitely could. If you would like to read it as opposed to listen to it. Yeah, Jane, I can send you a copy of the PowerPoint.
Thank you. Whoops.
All right. Thank you all. I appreciate you coming tonight and listen to me talk about protected species. I appreciate it. Appreciate your time, and I hope you found it interesting. Thank you.